Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. I'm pleased to welcome you to the final installment in our virtual Radcliffe discussion series, exploring health equity in the time of COVID-19. Videos of all our previous programs are now available on our website, and a recording of today's conversation will be posted in the coming days. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your support keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. I'm also grateful to my esteemed colleague, Dean Bridget Terry Long, and the Graduate School of Education for co-sponsoring today's program. As I've mentioned at the outset of each of our webinars, this discussion series reflects three critical elements of the Institute's mission. First, it reflects Radcliffe's commitment to examine and address pressing issues in our society. Second, it reflects our commitment to cross-disciplinary research and our conviction that insights from across academic disciplines can advance public discourse and reveal innovative solutions to complex problems. Third, and finally, this series reflects the Institute's commitment to equity and opportunity. We know that COVID-19 continues to disproportionately affect vulnerable and marginalized communities. Together, we have a responsibility to examine the disparities that the crisis has revealed and exacerbated, and to help chart a more equitable way forward. These discussions are a part of that effort. Today, we turn our attention to critical deficiencies in the American educational system. COVID-19 has exacerbated longstanding inequities in schooling. Decades after the landmark Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, racial and economic segregation continue and is linked to opportunity gaps by race in our country's school systems. According to the nonpartisan organization EdBuild, more than half of the nation's K through 12 students attend school in racially concentrated districts, those where over 75% of students are either white or non-white. And the districts that predominantly serve students of color receive on average about $2,200 less per student than predominantly white districts. The pandemic has cast the different educational experiences of students in our country into even sharper relief. Many students in under-resourced schools have been unable to access instruction on virtual platforms since the pandemic began, and they've been deprived of other supports available in some better funded schools. Even the wealthiest school districts are struggling to cope with COVID-19, and their most vulnerable students also have suffered. But we may still find opportunity in this crisis. Schooling has been upended across the country, and there is significant uncertainty about what the fall will bring. These difficult circumstances may constitute just the right context in which to rethink our system of public education for the better. We're joined today by four distinguished experts who will guide us as we explore this critical topic. Kevin Godden is Superintendent and CEO of the Abbotsford School District in British Columbia. Nasir is President of the Spencer Foundation. And Justin Reich is an Assistant Professor in Comparative Media Studies and Writing and Director of the Teaching Systems Lab at MIT. Moderating the discussion is my colleague, Meira Levinson, who is a professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. I'm grateful to all of you for being with us. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to turn the virtual floor over to Meira Levinson.
Thank you so much, Tamiko, Dean Brown-Nagin, for that introduction. I think you've set the stage beautifully for our conversation. So before we begin, I just want to give a quick overview of the format for today. First, we will have brief remarks by each of our speakers, followed by a conversation among the group. After that, we'll respond to questions from the audience. And so we encourage those of you watching to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We anticipate we'll get a large number of questions. There are a bunch of you on here, which is fabulous. So we ask that you try to keep them relatively short so that both I can skim them quickly enough to be able to take account of them, and also so that we can address as many as possible in the time that we have available. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Naila Suad Nasir to kick us off.
Great, thank you, Meira. It's such an honor to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. So, we're in this new national and global awakening around racial oppression and injustice. And as you alluded to, it's a unique moment. And I think we're seeing both the blatantly racialized and differential impacts of COVID-19, as Dean Brown mentioned, the abruptly rising levels of economic inequality in the context of a national economic crisis, and then multiracial coalitions of people literally taking to the streets to protest racism in policing and in society. And what they're protesting and what we're seeing with respect to racial inequality isn't new, right? It's racial inequality is manifested and perpetuated in every aspect of American life, from housing to healthcare to criminal justice, and of course, the subject of our conversation today, in education. And so I think it's worth pointing out that schools have been really central in this perpetuation of inequality since the inception of public schooling in this country, and even before that. But we're here today because in education, there also exists a possibility. The possibility to create something different, to change lives, to alter the direction of our society, to make things anew. And for me, really leaning into that work is what all of us should and could be doing at this time. So I've been thinking a lot about what this collective work is right now and what the possibilities are, even as we manage these spaces of chaos and uncertainty. And before the audience came on, various of our children were popping in and out of the screen. And I've been thinking a lot about what we are to give birth to in education in this moment. So I'm just going to raise a few issues to get our conversation started, and then I'll pass on to my esteemed colleagues. First, I want to note for me what I see as the openings and spaces for possibility in this moment. First, we've seen more change to education systems in the last 3 to 4 months than in the last 50 years. And we have learned that things we thought were set in stone are actually quite malleable. It's kind of exciting. There's also been more attention to racial inequity, more publicly, more boldly, and more inclusively than in my lifetime. We have recentered young people's lives, and in fact, all of our lives, in family, at home, in communities, thus raising the important role of family and the community in the education of children, and pushing back on narratives that view some families as capable of participating in their children's education, where other families might be less so. We've realized that all families have capacity and potential to productively participate in their children's education. And we've paused many high-stakes standardized tests at all levels of education, assessments which have been consistent in their privileging of white, middle, and upper-class students. And doing so creates the space for a focus on formative assessment and raises the question, how do we really know what students know and can do? And finally, for me, we are beginning to untangle learning from schooling and recognize that learning is a life-wide phenomenon. A lot of really valuable learning happens outside of school, and when given the freedom to explore, young people often choose to learn deeply and effectively about things they care about. Now, that's not to undermine the importance of educational institutions or concerns about learning loss or the loss of instructional time. And so my final point will just be, and there's this kind of raising a possibility that I pointed to, and there are tensions. And I think one of the major tensions that we need to wrestle with at this time, and I imagine we'll do this somewhat today in our conversation, is time. We are at once in this space that if we were thoughtful and intentional, we could bring students back into systems of education that are more equitable and ways of teaching and learning that support freedom for young people to study and learn about the things that are intrinsically interesting to them, that engage families in deeper and more respectful and more productive ways, that create a seamless connection between home, school, and community, that are explicitly anti-racist in approaches to pedagogy, in structures of access, in resources, funding structures. But at the same time, there's this pressure to reopen quickly and hopefully safely in ways that will push us potentially to reproduce the status quo, or worse, it will deepen existing inequalities and constrain possibilities to create spaces for expansive learning. Okay, with that, I will stop, and it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Professor Justin Reich.
Naya, you've raised so many incredibly important issues that I hope we'll be able to dig into much more while we're talking together today. One place that I wanted to start with just thinking about the challenge that you described there. How do we take really big, bold ideas about what the future of schooling could look like, a more equitable, a more effective, a more anti-racist schooling could look like, and combine that with the urgent challenges that we have now? And there are lots of different potential ways of doing that, but I hope that one piece that gets centered in our conversation, something that I've been working on for the last few months, is thinking about how do we get more stakeholders, more community members in the conversation of reopening schools. So there is exactly one generation of Americans that has lived through remote schooling during a pandemic. And that is, those students are the students who were in our classrooms this spring and are coming back in some places in America, 4 weeks from today or less. There are all kinds of things that adult policymakers know. There's all kinds of things that educators who work really closely with students know. But none of us, who are over the age of 21, know anything about learning in K-12 schools in the midst of a pandemic. And so I think our students should be some of the very first people that we bring into this conversation to ask them, what worked for you? What's important to you? What didn't work for you? What are the things that make schooling work best for you? What could you leave behind? To start doing that with another colleague at Harvard, Jalmeda, we started doing a series of different kinds of stakeholder meetings to bring together students, but then also to bring together students with parents and teachers and school board members and other family members and education policymakers and other kinds of folks who have a stake in education to say, how can we rebuild schools together? But certainly among the most powerful conversations we had was with a group of 15 middle school students in Nima Avashia's civics class at the McCormick Middle School, where we asked them 3 questions. What do you most value from school? What's really important to you when we start next year? And what could you do without? And my experience is that anytime you take young people really seriously and you promise to listen and you promise to do something with their ideas, they will give you their best, most serious ideas, and they can be very powerful partners in reimagining what schools could look like. And in our conversations, we talked about all kinds of things with students. Mostly we talked about the critical importance of relationships, which is at the intersection of both effective anti-racist practice and any kind of effective learning practice. And some students gave us really concrete things that we could work on next year together. One of the things that was overwhelming to students about remote schooling was that a lot of them had 6 different teachers who were giving them 6 different ways of dealing with their assignments, and they felt like they needed one adult who could be their primary point of connection as an advisor. That's something that lots of schools do that other schools could learn from and pick up. But one of our favorite parts of the conversation was a student who said, I want to be able to click a button and have a teacher come help me. Click a button and have a teacher come help you. What would that look like? There's no sort of obvious answer to that need, but as we thought through it, we thought, one of the really magical things about schools, and underappreciated magical things about schools, is that if you're a young person, just about anywhere you are in a school building, you can raise your hand. And within seconds, within a couple minutes, a caring adult will come next to you and start helping you with something. That's an amazing thing about a school building. Anywhere you are, you just put your hand up in the air, in the lunchroom, in the classroom, in study hall, in the library, and eventually an adult will come wander by and help you. What would that look like in an online setting? What would it look like for young people to have a sort of instant connection, or as close to instant as we can, with some kind of adult? We didn't know immediately how to design that, and what that would look different in kindergartens and 12th grades and in different kinds of schools in different places. But understanding that felt need, that sort of need to be, I need to be able to be seen by adults, and I need to be able to be helped when I get stuck, was sort of a design consideration from the voices of students that I think can help us think about next year. So in thinking about reinvention, I think one of our first tasks is going to be, who gets to participate in the conversations about reopening schools at the local level? Will it be just elected school board members? Will it be just district officials? Or do we really have room to include the voices of teachers, of students, of family members? And how do we find ways to not only include the voices who are most able, who have the easiest connections, who are most readily able to participate, but how do we really reach out, in particular, find the students who we feel and the families who we feel like schools have served least well historically, and find ways of bringing those voices, voices of people who speak languages other than English, into these kinds of conversations. So what's exciting is that one of our colleagues here, Kevin Godden from the Abbotsford School District, has started doing that work and has started reopening schools already in British Columbia. And for those of us in the United States, he provides us a little window into the future. So I'm super grateful that Kevin could join us today.
Hey, thank you, Justin. Really appreciate that. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nation. It's something that we do here as a part of our longstanding commitment to reconciliation with the Indigenous people in this country. Some of you might be wondering why British Columbia is invited to this conversation, and what I can say to you that many of the issues that Justin and Naila, you have surfaced here are very real issues here in Canada, and things that we truly have made a commitment to try to address. I do want to perhaps, as Justin said, because we had the opportunity to shut down and restart, share with you some perspectives, perhaps perspectives on the ground related to some of this work. So in a nutshell, our government made the decision in large part because we managed to actually flatten the curve here significantly in our province, such that we made the decision that it was okay to start school again. And the work that we did was driven by four key principles. One obviously had to do with safety. The other one, which was one that's not thought of very much, which was provide service to the children of our essential service workers. So think about if you work in the healthcare sector or you're a first responder, what happens to your kids in the middle of a pandemic? So we had to make some commitment to those kids. And then the third one had to do with our most vulnerable learners, those who are marginalized, who perhaps didn't have technology and didn't have the wherewithal. So we were driven by that. And the other one, of course, is just having solid online support for those families. What I will say was fascinating to me as we operated under those principles in bringing our kids back to school was this interesting experience with the adults. Now, it's not to say that obviously parents and kids were concerned, but when our government made the decision that we were going to bring kids back, albeit on a limited basis in the month of June, one of the things that we discovered was the impact that this decision had on the adults. And these are the ones, to go to Naila's point about creating more equitable spaces and using pedagogy that is enabling and culturally responsive. I want to play the idea to you that it is difficult for a teacher to embrace some of those very important principles that their rather excited superintendent is interested in advancing if they themselves are terrified of returning to their building, are terrified of being in contact with their colleagues, are afraid of crossing the threshold of the school door, the school exit, even though we know it is safe to do so. So what I would say as a critical point for me in this conversation is that it is absolutely important that we take advantage of this time, but it is also absolutely important that we do so in a compassionate, thoughtful manner. And what I mean by that is, one of the things we discovered was about the very real personal circumstances of our principals and our teachers, which impacted their ability to deal with the circumstances. And in the same way that I think, I'll give you an example. One of the things that we did in this, there's a gap between when we shut down and when we started online learning. And what we said to our teachers, we'd like you to simply pick up the phone and call each of your kids, each one of them, and just listen. Just listen to their story, find out about their circumstances, and find out about their capacity to do some of the work, so that you can tailor make some of the work that you're going to do with that in mind. And that was perhaps the best thing that we did, because teachers later told me that, while they had these kids in their class, in some cases for the entire year, in that very short time, in that very short phone call, they discovered things that they had no idea about with a child's family. So I see my time limit is arriving, but what I'll say is this, that this is critically important work. It's being done in a pandemic, and where there is trauma throughout the system. And unless the leaders in the system can do so in a compassionate, thoughtful, and creative way, we will miss this opportunity to take advantage of this and reshape education in a manner that we know is needed. So it's with that I will turn it back over to you, Professor Meira Levinson.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin and Justin and Naila, for those really provocative and thoughtful comments. I think I want to start with this question of trust and compassion that you've laid out for us, Kevin, because in some ways it also, I think, has resonances with things that Justin and Naila mentioned. In part, it is, I mean, you're echoing of listening to students and how crucial that can be, right? It was something that Justin directly talked about. Naila talked about recentering the family within learning, right? And all of those are ways, I think, to evince trust and to try to build trust. But at this moment, certainly in the United States, what we are seeing in the conversation about reopening schools is a massive lack of trust by almost everyone in almost everyone else, right? And I'm curious, therefore, to ask, Naila, why don't we start with you? To the extent that reopening schools in a way that is humane and realizes some of the possibility that you talked about, relies on compassion for others and trust in others, including trust that, say, the school systems will do the right things by our children, by our communities, et cetera. How do we build the kind of trust that I think we will need to get there?
Start with the easy questions. I mean, this is, in some ways, this is the challenge of our time as a society, as a set of institutions, in a context where we have where we are incredibly politically divided and behaving in really partisan ways that undermines trust in our systems. That's the smoothest way I can say that. And so I don't know what you do about, for instance, some of you may have seen our Secretary of Education on CNN yesterday, and for, underscoring demands for schools to reopen quickly without guidance about what that should look like or how schools should do. So I think we're set in a system that is showing its dysfunction. And then if that's true, then the only hope is for that trust to be local trust, for that trust to be the trust that's always been there to some degree between families, communities, and their local schools. And so I think you have to build on what already exists. That's where there's potential strength. And I think starting from the local might be the best approach around considering these issues of trust.
Kevin, can you build on that? I mean, you've tried to create trust. You know, your teachers were frightened and terrified. How did you build up that trust in a very local way in your school district?
Well, to Naila's point, I think, you know, the most critical trusting relationship is between the teacher and the student, and between the parent and the teacher. And so certainly that is there, and it's something that we've had to work at. What I'd say is, and I will perhaps go where my my grandmother used to say to me, that trust comes from trustworthiness, and so the people who have led us through much of this provincially, our medical health officer, for instance. There's a tremendous amount of trust and belief that we have in her. There's trust in the system here, I could say, that would cause us, as she said at one point, it's tough to unscare people. But because she said that, she opened the door for us to have conversations like that here about returning to work and embracing some of the guidelines that we had established for people. But I think, you know, I had several focus group conversations, and the number one thing that resonated through all of them, and this is to Justin's point, was about this enduring power of relationships. The classrooms and the relationships that were solid before the pandemic were in a position to blossom. And some of those situations that were less so, they struggled. And so I would only say that that's the foundation that we have to build this on. Relationships between teacher and student, relationship between principal and teacher, amongst teachers. It's a critical piece of the work that we have to do.
Yeah, I mean, that feels so right to me, and also in ways discouraging, because I think about, say, the surveys that I've seen of parents in the United States and their likelihood to send their kids back to school and their trust in the system. And unsurprisingly, what we see quite consistently across a number of different survey organizations is that white parents and wealthy parents actually feel much more trusting in the system and much more likely to send their kids back to schools if they open than do Black and brown parents and poor parents. And I have to assume that part of that is because Black and brown parents and poor parents send their kids to schools that on average are far less kitted out in terms of infrastructure, that already have much less trusting relationships on average between the schools and the communities of which they're a member. And so I fear in some ways that as our public institutions have this bifurcated relationship of trust with those toward whom they have acted in a trustworthy way and those toward whom they have not acted in a trustworthy way, that we risk then expanding this further as we go. I'm curious, Justin, you propose actually like a design charrette process for schools to build these relationships and develop some co-planning principles. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Sure, and Kevin was a great helper and participant in thinking through this. But you know, one of the challenges of the moment is that there's really high degrees of uncertainty. And when you're designing in uncertainty, you have to here's one particular tension that you have to hold together. One is you cannot possibly make all the right decisions off the bat in terms of reopening because you have insufficient data, not enough is known, circumstances change on the ground, schools are immensely complex. The central office cannot decide what you should teach on October 14th to the 7th graders in earth science classes. The work of schools is incredibly granular, which means that you need lots of people close to the ground, experimenting, trying new things, seeing what's worked, sharing what they're learning. But at the same time, those experiments have to be organized around a small set of principles. Like Kevin said, they had 4 principles that they were organizing what their school response. Or we also proposed the idea of tent pole ideas. You have to have a few organizational structures, a common schedule, a common way that you're planning on using buildings that can be shared widely in a school community, so that when the experiments happen, they can be sort of aligned with one another and that they could learn from one another. If you want people to be doing their own local experiments and to have those experiments be coherent, you have to invite people in the process of thinking about what are going to be those handful of core ideas, of core principles, of tentpole organizational ideas that you're going to work with. I think schools that normally do this best, they bring in communities of people into a room, and they have Post-it notes and markers and whiteboards, and they draw and write and share and eat together and all the kinds of ways that we're used to interacting. And it's not safe to do that right now. So part of our interest was saying, how do you do good participatory design online? So in addition to a group of students, we brought 3 different stakeholder groups together. And we had them go through 3 exercises. One was about thinking about what are the most important values to you right now, or the most important priorities. Which of those values do you think are ones that are sort of extant to your school communities that have been part of your school traditions for a long time? And which ones are new for this moment that we have to kind of reinvent or resurface? What do you see as the most urgent kinds of challenges from your different vantage point as a student or a parent or a teacher or a school administrator? And then we invited people to start doing some designing and prototyping, to start coming up with lots of different ideas and then trying to refine that down into a smaller number of ideas that people could work on together. And the process does a few things. One is it makes sure that it creates an opportunity for more people to have some kind of voice in the reopening process that connects with this idea of trust and relationship building that we've been talking about. The second is that, it may very well be that it's not federal officials or state officials or people who are currently working in their home offices like mine, sort of dreaming up what a good school might look like in a pandemic in theory. Some of those people might have some good advice, but I think lots of the best advice for this fall is going to come to the people who are actually teaching and learning in remote learning during the last spring. The people who this summer might have been running summer programs, including some in-person summer programs that are running in YMCAs and other kinds of places.
So can I interrupt you there and push you on that for a second? And then Neela, I'm going to turn to you after this with basic, the same question. So this is both inspiring and, part of what I think is these kinds of ideas of having the people on the ground who really do and experience the work, helping to shape what the work looks like, right? Those are ideas that we've had for decades, right? And as Neela said in her opening remarks, the idea is that we should have anti-racist pedagogies, that we should center family in learning, and that all families have funds of knowledge to contribute to learning, and that there aren't just like deep pits of need and then some privileged contributors, right? These are ideas that we've had for decades, and yet we've really, really struggled to realize them in any systemic way in schools. Why is now the right time to pursue this kind of ambitious design agenda, rather than simply getting kids, in front of a teacher who aren't struggling with internet access issues?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think part of the reason is that we have a good sense that if we simply go back either to remote learning in the chaotic form that it emerged this spring, or to face-to-face learning, in the simplest conceptions that have been put forward of, well, we're going to keep the desks 6 feet apart and we're going to all face them forward, and the teacher's going to stand in front and talk to people, and kids are going to have lunch sitting at their desks, and it'll be, like a sort of safe kind of prison-like environment for students to be able to go while their parents are at work. I think many stakeholders in the system have a deep, deep sense of dread about both of those ideas. Like, neither of those seem like satisfactory responses. And it seems like we ought to be able to come together as local communities and try to experiment with things that are better than that. In the decades in which we've been advancing more family-based planning, our baseline has been, school works okay, and we sort of know how to do it. But none of us know how to do what we're up against for this fall, and so maybe that's one reason to advance these ideas. And then, the second one is everything that we've been saying about trust and relationships, and that all of the technical questions about, who's going to hand out the PPE and where do we put the plexiglass and is the HVAC going to work and things like that. I mean, I think what you and Nalia and Kevin have pointed out so beautifully is that, behind all of those things, all of those technical implementations only work if there's trust, and we build trust by talking and listening to one another.
Great, thank you. I'm going to cut you off there and move to Naila because I want to make sure we get audience questions too. Naila.
Great, what a great question. So why now? That's your question.
Yes.
Right? I think because there's this opportunity now, and it's I think there are a few elements to that. One, the value of teachers in schools has been heightened as parents are home with their kids, realizing how challenging it is to do the kind of work that teachers do every day in much greater volume. So I think there's a public will around supporting teachers in education right now that we should lean into.
Mm-hmm.
I think resource inequalities is also on full display in our society. The idea that there were some kids and families who did not even have internet access was kind of unbelievable until we saw the numbers. And then what we saw is, with a bit of will, school districts partnered with internet service providers, and those, the digital divide has been not eradicated, but greatly reduced during this time, right? The third is that we cannot pretend that what we were doing before was working for most kids and families. And that has to do with the kind of equity things we've been talking about. But it's just also has to do with the fact that schools in their current iteration, when you put the structure and ways we do schooling up against the needs of an incredibly technologically savvy, independent generation of learners, there's a mismatch. There's been a mismatch. We've talked about this mismatch, and it's not just for, under-resourced communities. That mismatch exists for lots of kids along many racial and socioeconomic lines. And so this moment has shown us that we could do things differently, and to figure out how to make that a part of the infrastructure and the way that we do things feels really important. And finally, in this moment, we have known for a long time some things that work and some things we need to do, but we also have the learning science. We have the warrants from the research that says learning happens when kids feel connected. Learning happens when kids are intrinsically engaged in what they're doing. Learning happens when kids feel safe. Learning does not happen when kids do not feel safe. It's the neuroscience. And so I think we also have warrants around the research that would really push us in this direction right now.
Great. Thank you, Naila. So I am turning to the questions from the audience, of which we have many dozens, which I'm really appreciative of. One of the things that I'm really interested in is that a number of them, they're too nice to say this, but they're actually pushing us to think more broadly than we are, which is we have a number of questions about property taxes. And why are we funding school districts through property taxes? And is this the time actually to totally rethink who gets what resources in school districts across the United States? What I find interesting about that question is that they're taking us seriously with the title of this talk, right, is now the time to build a better system. And in some ways, what we've been doing is talking about building a better system within the schools and school districts that we already have. And a number of the audience members are asking us, at least implicitly, well, why are we taking those systems into as our givens? Actually, Naila, can we stick with you for a second? And We see the movement to defund the police, which is much more radical, right, than reforming the police. We see the movement that, at least, a few months ago, of a universal basic income was actually becoming of interest to a number of people and may be coming back now, right? There's some much more radical ideas about social and systemic reform that are actually gaining traction. Should we, beyond the idea of of anti-racist pedagogy, beyond the idea of project-based learning, et cetera, actually be thinking of totally tearing down school systems as they currently exist and rebuilding them in a new way?
Well, I was with you till you said tearing down, which I think
Okay.
is a little alarming, but I do think, I think these issues around resources are fundamentally important. Not only do we fund schools inequitably, partially due to this connection between property taxes and school funding, we also underfund schools across the board in the United States. So, and that's true it's obviously true for early childhood, because we don't really have a national system. It's true for K through 12, and it's true for higher education in the United States. We have been underfunding and defunding education for decades. And the numbers bear that out. So I absolutely think this is the time to consider some of those very basic structures that are not disconnected from the issues of what happens in the classroom or what happens pedagogically or how we engage communities. To my mind, those are all elements. So what does it look like to create an equitable system has to do with those very basic structures. Who gets what kind of funding and how much funding is there? How are teachers trained? Who are the teachers standing in front of young people or alongside young people? What are the optimal pedagogical structures for engagement? How do we teach real history in a way that connects young people to the identities and supports a kind of civic engagement rather than civic disconnection that we're seeing? So I think there are many big questions that this entails, and we've been talking about one piece of those big questions, but I would agree completely with those audience members that are saying it is time to actually really restructure what we mean by education, who gets access to what, and how we do things. And some of those things are starting to happen in small ways.
Great, thank you, Naila. Kevin, can you pick this up? Yeah, go for it.
Well, as a Canadian, I'm having. I don't think I can speak with great expertise about what Naila and you just described, because we do not do that here. As there's no national jurisdiction over education in Canada, so it's provincial, first of all. Mm-hmm. And secondly, regardless of who you are and what your address happens to be, the amount of funding that we get in our schools is the same. Now, no superintendent worth their salt would tell you that we have enough funding. You never do, right? However, the funding structures that we have, they're generally equitable. And as a matter of fact, we have supplemental resources for some of our most vulnerable students to allow school district systems to create the kinds of responses that we need. And so the case in point that I made earlier, many of our Indigenous students, we don't see the kinds of outcomes that we do for non-Indigenous students in British Columbia, but it's been a journey as a part of our long-standing truth and reconciliation in this country that we've been at. And so we receive additional funding for those students to embed, to Naila's point about indigenizing our curriculum and creating more resources, greater connection with our Indigenous students and families and communities. And so, we're on this journey. And what I would say is I would agree with the idea that the systemic grand issues that exist outside of the system need to be addressed. But at the same time, on the granular side of how we catalyze the kind of change that happens in the classroom needs to occur simultaneously with this, because that's the part that makes the most difference. And why now? It's because we have so many more teachers now, more so than were in January, aware of this situation and aware of the need for them to create more equitable learning spaces for kids. Now's the time that we need to continue to support them in doing that work.
Great. So let me actually, that sets us up perfectly for the next sort of theme I'm seeing in these questions, which is from audience members who are really curious about how they themselves can become advocates for increased equity in education in their own schools or districts. And Justin, in part because you and I have worked on Youth in Front together, on thinking about how we can help teachers be allies for students as they work to do advocacy. I'm actually going to read out a specific question. I am a rising senior in high school, and I'm interested in social activism, equity in schools, and pushing for a diverse curriculum. How can I, as a student, make change? Which I think is a great question, and it aligns with questions that we've also gotten from parents and from teachers who are audience members right now about how should they be pushing for equity within their schools.
Well, one thing that's exciting about the local control of schools is that many of the functions of how schools are run are in fact accessible, and through open meeting laws and things like that. School board meetings are continuing to happening online. There are in many places not that many folks who go to them, and people who organize to get involved in local politics can often be very successful in getting their voices at least heard. Leading to change is a different thing. I mean, I think in change of schools, we often talk about the sort of someday Monday dilemma, that the radical refiguring of schools is going to take a long time. And so we need to have a long arc of that. But also schools are opening in a few weeks. And so we want to try to do some things right now. But I would say, for a rising high school senior, it starts with bringing together other students who want to share conversations about this, and finding some faculty who are willing to be mentors and advisors, not leaders, not even really coaches, but kind of behind the scenes allies to those groups. I would find out when your local school board is meeting, who are the members of almost every local school district has a reopening task force. Who are the members of those, call your superintendent's office and find out who those folks are. One easy place to start is just to talk about, what are your priorities? If you have one approach is to come up with a list of 37 or 97 demands. It can be hard to listen to, fuse through all those things. It can sometimes be more effective to say, like, here are the 3 things that are most important to me that I most want to hear you talk about or read about, or that I want to participate in conversations with. Those are at least some starting points of sort of finding people in power. Write up what you think is important and start engaging with them. Find the other people, teachers unions, other groups that are engaging in these kinds of negotiations. And I hope that there are lots of educators out there who are excited to support students in this work. I mean, for good or for ill, in the United States, there has been more public conversation about public education in the last week as a matter of national conversation than I can't think of another time in my lifetime like this. And when these kinds of national swells of interest happen, it's a great time to reach out, to find other people who want to engage in this with you and make your voice heard. I don't know, Meira, did you have other specific things that you would answer to that question to students?
You're turning it on the facilitator?
Yeah, right. Well, you got good ideas. This is your area of expertise.
No, I think that's actually a pretty good list. I think also allying with others is the other thing I would say. I mean, it's powerful to say, here are my the 3 things I really care about. And I think it's even more powerful, I mean, you said this at the beginning, to say, here are the 3 things that we really care about, especially if that we is an inclusive we, and demonstrates that you've found really a diverse set of collaborators along a bunch of dimensions. Yeah, Kevin, I'm curious, who has been a powerful advocate in changing your thinking as you either reopened in June, or as you're looking ahead now to the next school year? And how have they changed your thinking?
Well, apart from my wife, You know, I took the time in the middle of this to, along what Justin was saying, to try to listen and try to model listening. And so I held several focus group meetings. We had a number of surveys, and of course we crunched the numbers, but I really wanted the voices of students and parents and teachers. I held a number of them. And so I'd say all of them had you know, some influence on the work that we are doing now. What I would say was, you know, I'll go back to the place where, you know, the most significant impact on the life of a student, apart from their parents, are teachers. And I had teachers who gave me this message, which I still carry with me, which is that there are a number of things that they discovered about their students that they absolutely just didn't know and want to continue that. Now the question was, what would you like to do that you are doing during the pandemic, that when this is over, whenever that is, that you'd want to continue? And I got some fascinating answers from teachers about that, all the way from how they engage with blended learning, how they interact with families, and how they, I'll say, value that which students and parents bring to the table, value the work that they do. And the one that caught me was that how they have been driven to work together as a staff more so than ever before, because they were reinventing this as it went on, and they needed each other. So those things I think have had the biggest impact on the work that we're doing now in developing our reopening plan. Now, as I said, we reopened, but certainly reshaping it for September for sure.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm not sure if we're going to get one more audience question or two in here, but again, synthesizing a number of different audience questions. Niela, can I ask you to be our first contestant in thinking through, various audience members have raised different groups who we should be particularly concerned about as we think both about reopening schools and about issues of equity. So among us in the conversation, we have talked about members of historically marginalized communities. We've talked about Indigenous people in Canada, although obviously in the US as well. We have talked about low-income communities. We've talked about differences in how schools have related to members of different racial and ethnic groups over time, historically. Questions have come up in the chat or in the Q&A about students with diagnosed disabilities, about young students, kindergartners, and actually ages 0 through 5, and how we should think about early childhood in this conversation. You raised, Kevin, the children of essential workers who have specific childcare needs and whose kids also may be experiencing greater levels of mental health challenges or trauma than other kids. Somebody's raised the question about gifted kids and, you know, if we are attending only to those who seem furthest behind, what do we do about special needs and giftedness areas? So Niela, help us think through when we have so many different claims to need and to differential attention, how should we think about that through an equity lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all really important. I don't know if anyone's mentioned in the chat students who are English language learners, and the needs of families that are not English speakers. So I think there's, in addition to the many groups people have talked about, there are many versions of children and families that don't fit our cookie cutter image of the way children and families should show up, right? And the challenge is, how do we build a system that attends to real children and families' needs, not the idealized norm, right? So I think that the question then is about, how do we think about organizing for learning in a way that attends to multiple kinds of needs? obviously, online platforms are not going to meet the needs for early learners. That's just, the toddlers are not going to sit in front of the screen.
Oh, they will.
That is an obvious point. And I think it also raises then the issue of how we organize access to early childcare. I mean, childcare and early learning in the United States, which is woefully lacking for working families or even families with significant means. That's maybe a whole nother topic you could do an entire webinar on in and of itself. And maybe you could say the same thing about the needs of students with disabilities. And I will say that, because it feels a bit relevant in this moment, we did just fund at the Spencer Foundation a set of studies that take up each of these, the needs of each of these populations in various kinds of ways. But I think thinking about, for students with disabilities, you have to think about what kinds of disabilities, what the needs are, the capacity and bandwidth of families to do what kind of work, how you organize instruction. So I think there are many, any crisis will make salient the needs of many various kinds of communities and people that are marginalized in different kinds of ways. I know. In my own professional history, I've done work on a university campus that looks to attend to the needs across many different groups. And I learned in that work and know from my own scholarship and education that it is never useful to argue that some groups' needs are more important than others, right? And we should always be thinking, designing systems to the extent that we can in universal ways that are targeted, that meet the needs of the many constituencies kind of on their terms and in the way that those needs need to be met. And maybe I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you. With that, because we have only 2 minutes left, maybe I'll ask Kevin and Justin, and then coming back to you, Naila. What is a nugget that you would like to leave audiences with that's ideally both actionable and forward-looking? And Kevin, this is putting you on the spot very quickly. Do you have one that you can launch us off into?
Well, I'll pick up on the same one that I left you with earlier, which it's a given that teachers have the most significant impact on kids. But if you back up to ask the question that you asked about the system, we always see classrooms in certain schools, but what about the entire education system? I will say that the most significant thing that we do to address that is how we invest in compassionate leadership. And that the work that we do with principals, vice principals, and people at the district level who lead these systems, they need to carry the same convictions that a classroom teacher does with respect to working with his or her students as we work with our schools, that the leadership makes the difference. And that's what helps create that. So
thank you. Justin.
One revolution which is currently underway is a dramatic involvement of families in young people's lives in education that has happened by necessity, but is something that people have called for a long time. And I think it's an exciting opportunity for those of us thinking about school both next fall and in the years ahead to say to ourselves, we have more family involvement in young people's formal school learning than perhaps ever before. How are we going to help families do that better? How are we going to make sure that doesn't just benefit the most affluent, most advantaged students? And how can it be more of a part of what schools in the future look like?
Fabulous. Thank you. Naila.
I would say that my one nugget would be that this work of reimagining and stepping into possibility means working from a place of hope and not a place of fear. So to the extent that we can, in our personal lives, in our personal interactions, come from a place of possibility and hope, in our systems, interactions and our systems set of values come from a place of possibility and hope, and begin to think about what does it mean to set aside some of the fear and uncertainty and be rooted in what's possible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Neela and Kevin and Justin, for participating in our program today, for your really thoughtful presentations and perspectives, and of course, for the critical work that you do every day that then prepares you to participate so thoughtfully in programs like this. I also want to thank our audience for your really terrific questions. I'm sorry that I did not get to all 58 of them. I hope that you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past ones at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today.